Vanya, for decades, US society claimed that African Americans were not able to form and maintain families, justifying this with the idea that slavery had destroyed or disrupted their families. How did this idea develop?
A lot of it came from well, it was an idea that circulated in society because, once slavery was abolished, now these are free people. And according to the principle of individualism, they are individuals. They have to have the same, uh, you know, liberty and pursuit of freedom allotted to all other US citizens, but that's not what happened. So to have excuses to treat them differently and unequally was not difficult. But sociologically, there was a book called The Negro Family in the United States that whose author was E. Franklin Frazier, who claimed that the that slavery had destroyed families because slaves had no authority over their families, over their children. Parents didn't have authority over their children. Husbands didn't have authority over their wives, and at any moment they could be sold to another owner, and then the family would be disrupted. And because of that, um, Negroes, to use the language at the time, didn't have had difficulty forming and maintaining their families. And so that idea persisted at least until the 1960s, if not the 1970s. And as a matter of fact, when Lyndon Johnson um, declared a war on poverty, after he had passed the Civil Rights Act of 1965, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which made it illegal discrimination in employment and education. Then the Voting Rights Act of 65, which made voting legal, well, in all U.S. territory for Blacks. We talked about that before. Then he said, yeah, but there's this persistent poverty, and I'm paraphrasing. We must eradicate it because it makes no sense for a country such as the United States, such a wealthy country, to have these, like this persistent pocket of poverty. So he declared a war on poverty, and he commissioned Daniel Patrick Moynihan, a sociologist, a white sociologist, Irish American, who had been a student of Frazier, who relied a lot on Frazier's study to write the Negro Family Cause for National Action, I think, the original title, but it came to be known as the Moynihan Report. And he wrote in the report that the reason so many Blacks were in poverty and in chronic poverty was because their families were unstructured, disrupted, and that they were matriarchal instead of patriarchal, because it's the husband father, who's supposed to be the head of the family. But among Negroes, especially poor Negroes in poverty, it's the mother and who takes care of the family, who has the authority, with no husband present. And so the children, especially the male children, the boys, grow up without a father figure. So then it becomes harder for them to assume the roles that society expects adult males to have, which are to be providers, to be heads of families. And Moynihan's solution for that was put them in the military, because then they'll have these male figures of tremendous authority, and so they'll learn to take on these social roles allotted to men. And one chapter of the Moynihan Report is about the effect of slavery on Negro families. I say, well, see, and then he cites it's comes out of Fraser's book. Look, the families were disrupted. That was in 1965 that the report comes out. But then in 76, a book comes out, The Black Family in Slavery and Freedom, that spans the 18th to the early 20th century, that shows like that's not what happened necessarily. Uh, Not all families were destroyed, disrupted, slave families. And when that happened, when children were separated from their parents, other adults assumed the parental roles, which is a West African tradition of the adults in the parents' generation having authority of over children, and that's something that persisted in the United States. Like you read that in novels, you see that in people who grew up in the South, and even in the in the North and the Midwest, up until relatively recently. If children did something wrong, any adult in the neighborhood could chastise the child. Like, what are you doing? So they would get it from the neighbors until wait till I talk to your mother or your father. It's something that is decreasing, but it used to be like that. And I often think, because these people would be like aunts and uncles, like fictive aunts and uncles. And I often tell my students that, like, obviously in Brazil, we also have, all kinds of evidence of the impact of West African culture, tradition. The fact that, I don't know if it's still like this, but certainly when I was going to, kindergarten and grade school, the teachers were aunt, right? We didn't call them, we could call them aunt this, aunt that. And to this day in Brazil, regardless of race or class, children call their parents friends aunt and uncle, right? Especially aunt. And I think that's a West African tradition, right? Because we can't call them by their first name because they are older than us. They're not our parents, but they could be our parents. And so, rescuing these studies, these ideas have helped to dispel this myth that Blacks cannot form families. But there's also the issue of class. If families are not in isolation, families are interrelated with the economy, with politics, with everything else in society. And so the harder it is for families to make a living, the harder it'll be for them to sustain their families. It doesn't mean that they will not have families or that their families will be problematic, but it'll be harder because people need to eat and need to have their basic necessities.